Thanks for tuning in to Lionheart Radio. I'm your host, Rick Alexander, and today I am joined by pilot, adventurer, and public speaker Laval St.Germain. Laval, thanks for being on.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Rick. And just for you people with your American accents, it's pronounced Laval.
Laval, I'm sorry. I'm sure that's not going to be the first thing you beat up on me for, culture-wise.
Yeah, it's funny how the only English speakers that pronounce my name that way tend to be Americans. But yeah, it's Laval, and you got it perfect now. Thanks, Rick.
Yeah, is that a common name in Canada?
No, not at all.
Okay, nice. Well, right pre-show, I was talking to you a little bit, and we talked about the fact that you were on the Art of Manliness podcast, and that was where I heard you the first time, and since you've done a few different shows. But your story is compelling, so I'm wondering for the listeners if we could kind of go back through maybe some of your accomplishments, and then from there we can kind of start to unpack it a little bit.
Yeah, you bet. And just to start it off, just thanks for reaching out to me, Rick. I've listened to your podcast and I really enjoy it. So I'm absolutely tickled to be on. So you fire away with whatever questions you want to hit me with.
Okay, great. So adventure is a pretty broad term. What was kind of the first catalyst, I guess, that got you started down this lifestyle to begin with?
My guess is that it would be my upbringing in just a small town, sort of a nondescript prairie town in the province of Alberta here in Canada, which is straight north of Montana. And I lived in a small farming community, very small farming community. My mom was from a farm, and because of that, I spent all my summers and Christmas holidays on my grandparents' farm working there. And when I got older, and prior to that, just playing around as a kid, a very free-range lifestyle. But combined with that time outdoors and no such thing as cell phones or looking at glass, as in iPhones and iPads back then, we had an outdoorsy family. My dad was big into hunting and fishing and canoeing and getting outside and skiing, and my parents really focused on outdoor stuff and doing stuff in the outdoors. First of all, it was very inexpensive, and we were sort of in an area that had lots of that type of opportunities as a young family. So my dad was focused on the outdoors, but he's also focused on learning and reading. So he really promoted us reading, and that meant we had things like Life magazine. It's a long defunct magazine now, but a fairly famous magazine back in the 70s and 80s, and National Geographic kicking around. And when you've got a National Geographic around all the time in your house as a young boy, and you sprinkle that with reading about the adventures of Tarzan or Huckleberry Finn or a very famous Canadian writer called Farley Mowat, it starts to make you wonder about sort of leaving the confines of your little prairie country town and maybe seeing these places all over the world. So when I was a little boy, my father, one of our big adventures when I was very small was to walk the roughly 8 kilometers or roughly 4 miles to my grandparents' farm. We'd walk down a railway track, and back then we didn't have plastic pop bottles. We had glass 7-Up bottles, and we'd put water in an empty 7-Up bottle and a little backpack and a sandwich and maybe a banana and a thermos, and we'd walk the 8 kilometers, which isn't very far, but as a little tiny boy, that was a big trip. And on the way, walking along the railway track, I'd pepper my dad with questions about things I'd read in National Geographic or things I'd seen on the news, and he really, I think, got my imagination going. And he was he is a very intelligent guy, and he knew a lot about the world. So those summertime walks down that country railway line, I think really helped with my my wanderlust and my love of traveling. So I was born into the right combination of parents, which is pure luck.
Right, but definitely important. So what's interesting about that is, when I grew up just in my kind of small town, I would say probably very similar, climbing trees outside all the time. And then what happened is I went on vacation to Hawaii my junior year of high school, and I realized I surfed, and I surfed at Pipeline, not when it was big, but I surfed and I mountain biked and all this stuff in the same day, and I realized oh shit, there's a whole world out there. What I think is really cool is the fact that you were able to pull that from just reading, right? Just from intellectually knowing, and that's there's something to be said for that for people that are listening to this, to like introduce your family to new things, even if you might not have the means or might be in a place that's not advantageous for adventure.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be expensive, Rick. It's I think it's just planting that seed, and I don't know if it's inspiration or motivation or simply downloading a little bit of information that sort of sticks there like a rock in your shoe and always that always bothers you because you want to do something or see something or go somewhere. And then one thing I didn't mention, which is just as critical as that intellectual need to travel and see the world, was my mom's focus on healthy living, so healthy diet and exercise. She was a real proponent of healthy body, healthy mind, and where my dad was more the intellectual type, so lots of reading, and my mom was more lots of activity. So it really was an interesting combination, and so far it's worked out well. I'm extremely focused on health and fitness, and for the type of adventures that I do or the type of interests I have, you have to be fit, and you have to be fit all the time. So without health, without fitness, you can't do these things. You could do them maybe in more of an intellectual sense, but to actually go out there and pick up a big heavy backpack or climb a mountain or even paddle a gentle river, you have to have a certain level of fitness, and my mom was really focused on that.
Right, yeah, and that's what's interesting is a lot of people, the gym isn't necessarily the end, or it is the end, and for you it's kind of the means. It's just the ticket to play the game, right?
Yeah, all it is making sure that I'm always tuned up for my next trip. And without that overall fitness, without that functional fitness that you get from a well-rounded routine, you wouldn't be able to do this stuff, or I wouldn't be able to do this stuff. So it's critical, hypercritical, I'd say.
Right, no doubt. So what is this stuff then? Just for the listeners, like, can we go over some of the mountaineering expeditions and things of that nature so people kind of know the scale we're talking about here?
Sure. I mean, there's a few, so I guess I can sort of go over it quickly. But it all started with a scuba diving trip when I was 21 to Honduras. A buddy and I went down there, and as an airline employee, I'm an airline pilot by profession. We get very inexpensive travel deals all over the world with just about every airline in the world, so we can travel for next to nothing anywhere. And I've really taken advantage of that as an airline employee. So Honduras, really, I always had a love for Latin America. There's Spanish and French have a fairly close connection linguistically, both Latin languages, and I found it very easy to pick up Spanish. And I really enjoyed the language, and I enjoyed the culture, and I enjoyed sort of the rough and tumble of Central American travel. So that turned into a trip to Bolivia, where I climbed the highest mountain in Bolivia, and that was my first higher mountain. But prior to that, I've done a lot of ski mountaineering in Canada, so ski touring. Mm-hmm. We're up in the Canadian Rockies, middle of winter, and you're climbing with skins on your skis, so you can go uphill but not slide backwards. And of course, when you get to the top, you pull the climbing skins off and ski down, and that meant sleeping in tents in the wintertime, snow caves, that type of thing. So I was accustomed to wilderness travel, and it turned into mountaineering, specifically ski mountaineering, and then just pure mountaineering. And I combined a trip to the highest mountain in Bolivia, which just about killed me from high altitude cerebral edema, to climbing in the Cascades in your country. Really enjoyed that. I was based in Vancouver, British Columbia as a young airline pilot, so I was able to simply get in my 1984 Toyota Land Cruiser and drive down to the Pacific Northwest and climb down there and ski. And then I went to Aconcagua, the highest mountain in South America, and then climbed that by myself. And then I did Kilimanjaro, and then I did Elbrus, which is the highest mountain in Europe, in the Caucasus Mountains of southern Russia. And, mm-hmm. and interspersed with that, I got into adventure racing and mountain bike racing and trail running. Went to Iran, climbed the highest mountain in Iran solo and skied down it. I'm trying to think. Highest mountain in Canada, highest mountain in the U.S., Denali. Highest mountain in North America, I guess you'd say Denali. Highest mountain in Mexico, Orizaba. And then I don't want to keep listing all these mountains. And then I set my sights on Everest. And I grew up reading a lot about an Italian mountaineer named Reinhold Messner, and I really wanted to attempt to climb Everest without oxygen. So in 2010, I was fortunate enough to have the genetics and the fitness and the weather, and it all worked out. And I was so far the only Canadian to have climbed Everest without using bottled oxygen. So that sort of, I guess, was my claim to fame. Even though prior to that I'd done some good climbing and some good adventuring. And after Everest, I went to Iraq, and it doesn't sound like a ski mountaineering destination, but there's some very nice high mountains, remote mountains in Iraq. And I went in solo to the highest peak in Iraq called Chikadar, kind of snuck in past the security forces and skied up that, climbed it, skied down it. And on the way out was captured by the Iraqi security forces and held for about 4 hours, maybe 6 hours, I can't remember now, of questioning. And they let me go, and I flew home, and then I went to Indonesia and climbed the highest mountain in Southeast Asia, and then to skip ahead a bit, I last summer, so the summer of 2016, I should say, I rowed a solo ocean rowing boat, 20-foot long ocean rowing boat from Halifax, Canada, so the mainland of Canada to the mainland of Europe, and I landed in Brest, France, crossing the North Atlantic. So that's a very high-level overview of some of the stuff that I've done. There's been some other stuff in there too, but it's a very fairly varied list.
Right. So what's wild is even when you try to list it humbly, it sounds fucking crazy. There's so many mountains in there. And we're talking like these are Everest, Kilimanjaro, Denali. These are mountains that people know, that they don't have to be into mountaineering to know that these are, some of the highest mountains in the world. So I have to wonder, when I'm listening to you go through all this and the adventure racing and the different sports, how has your body held up throughout all this?
Surprisingly well. I've only had a couple of injuries, and they've been injuries from things like falls, not chronic injuries. I tore a muscle once in my quad on an ultra marathon. I've fallen adventure racing, and had to be helicoptered off the top of a mountain from an injury. But other than that, I've healed up quickly, and I'm a real proponent of first of all eating healthy and active recovery. So I don't think I'm the best patient when it comes to doctors saying just take it easy. I'm always on the move. Like recently, about a week ago, I hurt my back doing deadlifts in the gym, and the way I dealt with that is just to keep working out and obviously avoided the deadlifts, but just stay active. And I've really felt that that's helped me. Whether it's clinically the correct thing to do at all times, I'm not sure, but I think it really helps to stay moving. And it's interesting, that injury I talked about on the top of a mountain in the adventure race, which was on the Queen Charlotte Islands off the coast, the west coast of Canada, near the Alaskan border, actually. And I was running along a mountaintop, and I fell and landed on the outside of my right leg and had this hematoma. My whole leg swelled up. And anyways, long story short, 11 days after that race, I had an expedition to one of the most remote mountains in the world, and it's up on Ellesmere Island. If you can imagine a map of Canada, we have the mainland of Canada, and then you've got the Arctic islands, archipelagos, or all those islands in the Arctic that sort of go up to a point just within a few hundred miles of the North Pole. I was up on that very, very northern island, and I had to pull a sled for a week across the dry tundra of that island until I got to the glaciers and pulled this heavy sled up into the mountains and ski the highest mountain in Nunavut, which is Canada's most northerly territory. And this mountain had only been climbed at that point eight times, so extremely remote. And 11 days after that injury, where I was on crutches and helicoptered off and in the hospital, I pulled it off. My buddy and I, Mike Wilson, went up there, and we did that expedition. So I think that's the epitome of active recovery. It was painful, so painful that I couldn't even sleep at night in the tent for the first 5 days, but eventually got better. And by the end of the trip, I think I was fully recovered, other than I had this massive bloody hematoma moving around my leg from spot to spot for the next 6 months. But it seemed to really work. So if anybody wants to recover from a leg injury, head to Nunavut, pull a heavy sled across the tundra.
Not putting that out as advice. Man, this is wild. So One of the things I'm interested in, and sometimes you check out these programs online for in the health and fitness space, and there are people like Mountain Athlete and these different organizations that are like, we're going to train you for adventure. And I always wonder on some level, well, isn't that just training, right? Isn't that just being fit and then being able to kind of handle this adventure as a byproduct? But if we could just take a moment to look at your individual training, 'cause you mentioned deadlifts, like what does it look like? Are we doing some high intensity stuff or more some aerobic capacity? Like where does your training fall?
I do it all. So I know your background, Rick, and I know that you're a fit guy, and you guys are heavily into CrossFit type training and body weight exercises and that type of thing. One of the things that I do is I split up my strength training workouts, but I also always mix in endurance training with them, and it all depends what I'm focusing for when it comes to an expedition, but I really don't have to modify them much. So, for example, my workouts are fairly simple. I've got a workout day, which is all body weight. So that's pull-ups and chin-ups and dips and push-ups and even squats with no weight on it, lunges with no weight, but just very high repetitions, very clean, very deep. So that's a brief overview of the body weight. And then I have a dumbbell day where I use only dumbbells. So, for example, I'll lay on my back on the floor on a mat, and I'll do flies laying on the ground. And at the same time, combined with that, I'll do leg raises. So I'm working 2 body parts at a time. Well, 3 actually. I'm working my pecs, I'm working my tris, and working my abs while I'm doing that. Dumbbell days, of course, if you can just imagine all the different things you'll do with dumbbells, from lunges to shoulder press to curls to tris. That's a dumbbell workout. Then I have a barbell workout, which is exactly what it sounds like. You do the typical barbell exercises: deadlifts, squats, bench press, curls with an easy curl bar or a straight bar. Lunges sometimes, if I'll mix it up with the dumbbell lunges. I'll also do barbell lunges. Straight-legged deadlift for your hamstrings, that type of thing. So those are my 3 primary workouts when it comes to weights or strength training. And I think strength training, if I just want to add this for all the endurance athletes out there, is extremely important. I think if you just run or just bicycle, you don't have the all-around fitness that you need for outdoor sports. And then with the strength training, I always run or I always cycle. And that can be an hour-long run, sort of slow and an hour type of thing, or it can be running stairs, so very high intensity anaerobic stuff. And I like to mix those up. So I work out every day. I think in the past 2 months I've missed 1 day. So I work out every single day. And that doesn't mean that I'm completely knackered all the time, because some of my workouts, an hour-long jog slowly, is not a tough workout whatsoever. Or even doing a short 30-minute stair session of running stairs is not that difficult to work out. So that's sort of a real high-level brief overview of the type of workouts I do, but really focused on all-around fitness, really focused on core strength as well, because if you think about it as somebody who sort of plays in this outdoor sports realm, you always picture us as being guys who have to be really good at going up hills. People think that we're super skinny, or I should say super not muscly, and going up mountains you have to be very light and skinny. Well, you have to also pick up a backpack that sometimes on some of these expeditions, when you start off, you may have 100-pound backpack. So imagine picking that thing up, twisting it, putting it on your back. Or you have a partner who falls into a crevasse and you've got to pull them out of a crevasse. Or you're an ocean rower who has to pull in what we call a para anchor. So it's like this giant underwater parachute that is 300 feet of heavy duty rope they have to pull in by hand. So you can see that having an all-round level of fitness is extremely important. So that's what I try and practice, and I'm religious about it.
Yeah, to kind of unpack that, I think some of the things I heard is like a real focus on like the multi-joint compound lift type movements. And then what's interesting is even the ones that aren't multi-joint, you kind of made multi-joint, which I have to imagine has a lot of crossover. And then I also really like the notion that when you go out on these adventures, you don't want to be a liability. You want to be able to pull your buddy out of a crevasse or be able to handle whatever kind of adverse situation the world hands you. And so that's got to be a good motivation to keep up with this lifestyle, if nothing else.
Yeah, and I think that comes also from my background as an airline pilot, Rick. So as an airline, as a pilot, and you always have redundancies. You always have backup systems and backup procedures. And I mean, for example, every single flight in North America right now, an airline flight, has a destination airport and has an alternate airport. Plus, we have fuel added to the fuel required to fly to the destination, miss the approach, go to the alternate airport, and not get in for 30 minutes, just circling around the airport waiting. So you can see that that's a huge amount of just fuel redundancy there, not to mention all the redundant systems we have in the airplane and the redundancies we have even the way we perform in the cockpit. So if I take that and I extend it into adventure sports and the outdoors, I think that as a machine, in quotation marks, as a person, you have to have those redundancies built in, meaning that you have to have trained in a way that will not only get you up a hill, but get you out of a crevasse, get your body out of a crevasse, allow you to move heavy boulders. For example, when you're setting up a tent and you've got to tie it down in a storm in the Himalayas or in the Rockies, these are all things that people don't plan for. But you can imagine that if you're really good at going uphill and then you have to set up a tent and there's a 60 knot wind blowing in the Himalayas, you have to lift a lot of rocks to make sure that tent doesn't blow away. And if you hurt your back doing that, if you pull a muscle in your back or worse, you're done. I mean, you could be done literally and figuratively. So it can mean going home or not surviving with an injury like that. So you can see that really critical. And now you extend that into being in the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean by yourself in a 20-foot rowboat in a storm. If you were to sustain an injury that was because of the fact you weren't physically prepared, that could be the end of the trip, meaning a shoulder injury, tricep, bicep, back injury, anything like that, right. The trip's over because your body is the engine that's going to get you across to Europe. So I find it really interesting, and I find that one of the greatest challenges is trying to hone your body in a way and sculpt it in a way that it performs in all these different environments.
Have you ever read the Checklist Manifesto, the book?
Atul Gawande, yeah.
Yeah, Atul Gawande.
I lived it.
Yeah, right, exactly. I was wondering, but for the listeners, it's this idea that so much risk can actually be taken out of the equation by something as simple as a checklist. And in the book, he talks about how medicine has done that as well as pilots have done that.
So where it came from in the medical field was the aviation field. And this all stems from, I wrote a blog post about this recently on my website, but it all stems from a crash of a Boeing B-17 bomber during sort of the test flights of it in 1935. And prior to 1935, there were no checklists. That's it. Pilots were considered godlike, and they were going to get in an airplane and figure it all out and go flying. Well, the B-17 was complex enough that it had systems on it and things that could go wrong where they needed a checklist. So what these guys did is on one of these flights is they took off and they didn't have the gust locks removed. So these are the things that lock the control locks on the airplanes. Of course, the airplane got airborne. They weren't able to fly it, and they just rolled it into a ball and crashed it. And that was the first checklist that was developed after that. Oh. So really interesting. And that checklist has now gone into, obviously aviation from that day forward. And now in the past maybe 10 years has been incorporated. That idea of a checklist has been incorporated into medicine.
Yeah, and the impetus behind that is that humans are inherently lazy, or that they'll miss things that become routine, and so
absolutely, we call that drift, procedural drift. And one way to look at that is that if I'm not sure where you live, Rick, but if every day you're able to sort of run a stop sign, meaning that that every day if you don't come to a stop at that stop sign, maybe look left once and do the turn or go across the intersection because you've done it 300-400 times and never had any issues. You never have any negative feedback from running that stop sign. So you start to drift in the procedures. The correct procedure is to stop, look both ways, and cross that intersection. But if you don't have any negative feedback, you're gonna cut corners, and that's human nature. That's the way we're designed.
Right.
So when you have a checklist, even though I've flown a Boeing thousands of hours in my life and I could fly all day long without a checklist, 9 out of 10 flights I'd be fine. But on that 10th flight, the consequences could be very serious if I missed a significant item. So it's very important that we stick to procedures, and that's something else that I've let morph into my adventuring. It's the way I've prepared and the way I've equipped myself, and using that aviation sort of checklist ideology and preparation ideology as well.
So just off the top of my head, I'm thinking, have there been adventures that you've gotten into where you realize, and maybe Everest, Iraq, I really don't know, but where you kind of got into it and you were like, oh, wow, like there's almost, obviously preparation matters, but there's a lot of just kind of grit and luck involved here?
Oh, absolutely. There's always luck involved, especially when it comes to the weather. I mean, when I crossed the North Atlantic, I just happened to have a summer where I had lots of storms that hit me, but all the storms that hit me because of just where I was, the timing when I left, were all pushing me towards France. Very rarely was I pushed the wrong direction or pushed too far north. So that was luck. But I mean, that luck was also because of the time I left. Now, if I would have left later in the season, these storms wouldn't have been so advantageous. Earlier, they wouldn't have been advantageous. So what do they say? That luck is when preparation meets opportunity. And so I did have a lot of luck when it comes to situations like that. Sometimes on Everest, you don't even have the proper climbing window to get to the summit on some seasons. So the season that I went, we did have that window. So yeah, luck's a big deal. But yeah, I get into situations all the time where it's just head down and you're working so incredibly hard because you've got to rush to get somewhere because of the timing. It could be the tides that you're going to miss coming into France. It could be the fact that you have to get that weather window to summit Everest. It could be the fact that you're trying to cross a river that it's going to be, because as the season's getting late, it's getting higher and higher and higher, and you will not be able to wade across, and you will literally be trapped if you don't. So yeah, there's luck involved, but there's also a lot of struggle, a lot of hardship, and I think that's something that I look back on with fondness is the tough times when you're out there. Far more than I think you learn a lot more from the real hardships out there than you do from the real easy breezy stuff.
Right. When you're talking about the row, for the listeners, that was a solo row across the Atlantic Ocean, correct?
Yeah, across the North Atlantic. So the normal crossing of the Atlantic Ocean via rowboat is the opposite direction. They leave from the Canary Islands off the northwest coast of Africa, and they get into the trade winds. And the trade winds are the way that Columbus came to the New World. He actually left the Canary Islands, where these guys leave from, in rowboats, and he crossed and ended up in the New World in the Caribbean. So the normal route is from the Canary Islands to Antigua. You've got constant winds pushing you towards North America. It's warm. The weather's good. It's a completely different ball game. The North Atlantic, it's cold. It's gray. You don't have those trade winds. You also have some fairly significant storms. And so I wanted to do something a little bit different, a little bit original.
Yeah, just make it easier on yourself. I got it. So how long were you out at sea for that one?
53 days.
53 days. How do you sleep?
Well, you've got a cockpit in the boat, so it's imagine crawling into an area about double the size of the inside of a common dishwasher. You climb in there, and you've got a water-sealed door, and you seal it, or a waterproof door. You seal it, and you line a little sleeping bag on a foamy on the floor, and in big storms, you actually have a system where you strap yourself to the bottom of the floor, or to the floor as opposed to the top of the floor, onto the floor, so that you don't get thrown around inside of the cockpit of this little boat. So yeah, you've got a tiny area on the outside of the boat where you sit and row. It's big enough to maybe walk 2 steps left and right, and it's about 4 feet across, I guess. And then the inside of the cockpit is, like I said, about double the size of maybe 2.5 times the size of a dishwasher inside, and it turns into a tumble dryer in a storm, or I guess it'd be a tumble washer in a storm because sometimes water gets in.
And so you just drift where you drift while you're sleeping?
Yeah, and if the wind's the wrong way, you put out that thing that I call a para anchor. So that's this underwater parachute that will cause a lot of drag, and it sits quite a ways below the surface, and it inflates. And you can, the boat along the surface is being blown the wrong way, but it's being counteracted by the drag from this parachute. So if I was in a big blow, a big storm that's pushing me back at 6 knots, let's say, back towards North America, I would put this para anchor out, and my drift would slow to about 1 knot, 1.5 knots per hour. And so during the night, you may drift 10, 11, 12, 15, 20 nautical miles, depending on the storm, the wrong way. But fortunately, most of the storms that I had were blowing me the opposite direction towards France. So most nights it was not sleeping at all because you're in such a big storm that the boat was capsizing. You had to make sure you're going down the wave the right way, and it's pitch black. And yeah, it was fast and furious and rough, but it all worked out.
I was gearing up for a rowing adventure this summer, and one of the guys, I remember talking to him, he told me, you can want to get there as bad as you want, but if the weather doesn't want you to, that's all there is to it.
Oh yeah, it's you are just this speck out there in the wild blue of the sea, and you can't get away from anything. You're moving when you're rowing at a hard pace. You're doing about 2 knots, and 2 knots, it would take you days to get out of the way of a storm, or even weeks or months. So it's a crapshoot, and you have to pick your route. You have to. I had a really good weather guy, or what I call my wind, weather, and waves guy, and he gave me all the information. But at the same time, if he told me a storm was coming, he'd say, you've got to try and get east of it. I'd kind of do the math and look at when the storm's coming. I said, okay, great, I can row all day long, and I'll go 12 nautical miles today, so I'm not going to get in the way of anything. So you're sort of really at the mercy of the weather out there. And for me, as a guy who's always been a terrestrial, meaning always doing my stuff on land and mountains and trail running and cycling and that type of thing, it was really, really, really stepping outside my wheelhouse, my comfort zone to row an ocean. Took me a lot of preparation, and then that day when I shoved off from Halifax that morning at 5:45 in the morning, I'll never forget that feeling of going into the unknown. And I've equated it before in different interviews to doing a spacewalk, but without a tether, because you just don't know if you're going to get back again. And it was emotionally and psychically pretty damn difficult to do that.
How has your wife taken that kind of emotional toll of, like, at 5:45 I'm pushing off, don't know if I'm coming back?
Well, fortunately, she's never known me to be any different. So right when I met her, I think a couple of days later, I was gone to Africa to go climbing. So it's something that she's only ever known. It's not like I used to golf and then turn into an adventurer. It was I've never golfed. Well, actually, that's not true. I golfed once 16 years ago. But she's never known anything different, and she's very supportive. However, just to give you an illustration of it, the ocean row was very difficult for her, and it was difficult because she doesn't like water. She doesn't like being out in the middle of an ocean. She finds it, she said, claustrophobic. We're people that live far from the sea, where we live in the middle of the continent here in Canada, and I had no ocean experience at all, although I spent months and months prepping. And on top of that, we've lost a child to drowning. 3 years ago, we lost our son Richard to a canoeing accident up in the Northwest Territories here in Canada, and so we have a real mixed relationship with water.
Sure.
And so she was very torn about this trip, and I took them, and in order to sort of to bring some comfort to them, I took Janet and our 2 remaining children, Andrea and Eric, to Europe, to the UK, where I had the boat built, and I had them see it. Eric and I rowed it, and gave her a real level of comfort to see the boat and understand the systems on it and how robust it was. But on the flight home, we were in Iceland on the flight home from the UK, and her and I went for dinner one night, and we were both sort of in tears, and she asked me, why do you need to do this stuff? And, I still can't answer that. I'm not sure. It's just sort of, I guess, who I am. But to contrast that, when I decided to go to Everest in 2010, it was a fairly well-known story now. I poured her a couple glasses of wine and said, babe, I think I'm going to go climb Everest without oxygen. And she just didn't even pause and said, it's about time, you're not getting any younger. So you can see the contrast there. She had a level of comfort with my mountaineering background and my endurance type stuff, but the ocean was something completely different. It was for both of us as well. Yeah. It was a tough trip.
Yeah, I can imagine. So I think because everybody that listens to this is human. I wasn't going to go here, but one thing I kind of want to bring up is the fact that you you dealt with this tragedy, which you just touched on there, in the loss of your son, and then you decided to row, which is like, you know, arguably polar opposite. But I'm wondering, when people are going through tough times, like, do you have any kind of advice? And if you don't, that's okay, for people that are looking at these just almost seemingly, you know, insurmountable catastrophic losses. Like, how do you continue after that? And how did you find I guess maybe the motivation or the courage to just kind of look all that straight in the face and do what most people would consider, you know, kind of taking that head on, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, it's for a parent, there's no greater loss than losing your child. It's something that you never recover from. So I'll just get that out there right now. But you know, having said that, losing a child is the worst nightmare you can experience. But having been through it as a family and as a couple, I can tell you this, that you go through the death of a child, you go through the absolutely existential crisis of that, and you realize that even though you've been touched by this tragedy, you've been scarred by it for the rest of your lives. And I'm sure people describe us, if we're standing at a party or something, or we're being introduced as that's the family that lost their son 3 years ago or 2 years ago, or depending on when it occurred. And that's something that never goes away. You got that scarlet letter, I guess, of having lost a child. And one thing it doesn't do is it doesn't prevent you from being happy again. And I think people need to know that. And I can really testify to that, because when it happens, there's nothing worse, and you don't know how you're ever going to be happy again or enjoy life again. But I've said this before, you've got this infection of tragedy and sadness in your life and despair, but at the same time, it doesn't prevent or doesn't inoculate you against ever being happy again. We laugh just as hard as we used to. We have good times with our friends and our kids, and we still travel, and we still really enjoy life. But of course, this is just this chronic condition we have now, and this sadness that's always with us. But you can still live with it, and you can still thrive with it, but always knowing that you have this newfound wisdom about death and about loss. So when people are in these the pits of despair over the death of a child or a loved one, or any time in life when things are at their absolute worst, you know, you can take it from me and take it from Janet that even though we cry just about every day about it, or we have memories about it just about every day, you can still live life fully and happily, but with that loss, that scar. And it's very important to know that. And it's just like my description of being in a storm in the North Atlantic for 4 days. And, you know, eventually that storm ends and the sun is shining and you're moving on across the sea. And it's, you know, it sounds cliche, but that's exactly what life's like. We weather these storms, and, you know, these storms always end.
Right.
When it comes to things like tragedy. And then it is, you do find this newfound wisdom and a newfound empathy for loss. And, you know, it's not a unique thing to lose a child. In our Western European and North American context, it just doesn't happen. It's out of order. But if you think about what goes on daily around the world, I mean, people are suffering the loss of one child or all their children at all times in war and genocide and that type of thing, and they survive. So we are extremely resilient as a species, as humans, and we need to know that. People need to realize that you can keep on moving on.
Right. I have to imagine that the actual act of physically moving forward, there has to be some sort of underlying empowerment there as well.
Yeah. If you mean that when we look back at it and the fact that we've been able to come out of this as healthy as we can as a family, I think, yes. There is looking back at the storm we went through and realizing that we came out intact as we can be, I think is an important consideration and part of that newfound wisdom. But we did it deliberately. I mean, we pulled out all the stops when it came to making sure we came out healthy. We went to group grief counseling. We talked to people about it. We made a promise as a family that we'd always talk about it. So we never hide it. We don't let our friends tiptoe around it. If they want to bring it up, if they want to say, geez, our son Eric is 16, and the people will say, geez, Eric reminds me of Richard, the way he said that or moved or played his guitar that way or laughed. And, we make sure that people don't tiptoe around us about that. It's just, it's part of our life, and it's the shits, plain and simple, but it happens, and it's just a horrible tragedy, but we're not unique. It happens every day to people all over the world. And I remember that day clearly when it occurred, that day, and this sounds so strange, but that day there were 3 Israeli soldiers that were killed in Israel that day. And they were all, 19 to 21. And I remember that day when we got the news early that morning that Richard was gone, that I remember saying to Janet, my wife, that there's 3 families right now on the other side of the world in Israel going through the exact same thing as we are. Isn't that horrible? So, yeah, you got this, you're part of a horrible club.
Yeah, right. The ability to just keep perspective in that situation, and then also in real life, physical situations where you're like weathering the storm in the Atlantic, like you said, or on a mountainside. Just, I got to imagine that the importance of that ability to just keep perspective, to know that storms come, to know that the sun still is going to shine, and to know that, there's another day tomorrow.
Yeah. I think I've learned that. I mean, it's Richard's death didn't all of a sudden make me say, hey, I'm going to become an adventurer. I was doing that beforehand. And the way I've dealt with it specifically is I've confronted it head on. So after Richard died, I decided to ride a fat bike from the Yukon up to the Arctic Ocean in the middle of winter. And I failed. It was minus 46 degrees. I froze a toe, and, I had to go and get this toe treated from frostbite, and I couldn't continue on. But I went back the next year and I did it. And the reason I did that ride, I did it in reverse order from the Arctic Ocean to the Yukon, was because I wanted to ride that same, it's a gravel highway in the Arctic that the kids and I rode when Richard was 13 and his sister was 11. And it was such a big deal for those kids. They're still the youngest people to have ever ridden that road on a bicycle. It's very remote, it's gravel, 800 kilometers long in the Canadian Arctic, camping in a tent every night. And he always really, that was a special trip to him. So I went back and I redid it in the wintertime, and it was incredibly difficult psychologically because of looking at the places we camped and the creeks that we had stopped and thrown rocks into, and everything was cold and dark and frozen over, and it was pretty cathartic for me to do that. And that's one way I confront it, is to go out and, I guess, hurt myself in the outdoors and suffer.
Right. When you look at all these adventures, the fat bike and the rowing and the climbing, do you ever start to feel like the world's kind of running out of canvas for you?
No, there's so many things to do, and there's so many inspirations out there. And it doesn't have to be these big things. It can be some of my greatest accomplishments are just the little things I do with the kids, little week-long trips or 10-day-long trips or overnight trips, or there's just something, losing a child also gives you this renewed awareness of how important your remaining children are. And I just love it. Our 16-year-old boy now is working on his pilot's license, and just to sit with him and study with him at night and talk about flying or go on a bicycle tour with him. Those are the best things to me ever. So,
yeah. Looking at all of these different things that you've done, you mentioned at the very beginning of the show that you started off kind of like reading, and we talked a little bit about how culture and how the world is now with screens and with, I guess just inherently faster. And the thing about adventure is, although exciting, although there's the risk, a lot of these are slow moving activities, right? When you're talking about fat tire biking, when you're talking about rowing, just that's you're in the slow lane at that point.
Yeah.
And I wonder how has it been for you kind of coming up with this world where you really, you're entrenched in these things that make you slow down, they make you go internal, and just kind of dealing with that, the actual culture that we're in. Has that been just such a stark contrast for you?
I've never really thought about that, Rick, and that's a great question. So it's interesting as you were verbalizing that question. I was thinking about the way I confront these massive distances I travel, and the way I do it, and it's cliche, we've heard 1,000 times, but it's one day at a time, or it's one corner of a time on that one corner at a time on that bicycle ride you're doing, or that corner in the river, or that rock on the side of the hill, or that Latin long position on the North Atlantic. You just break down these massive trips into bite-sized chunks, and that's the only way to do it. If I was shoving off and thinking 5,000 kilometers of rowing. 5,000 kilometers of rowing is a long drive. It's a long flight, let alone a rowboat trip. It would be overwhelming. So I break it down. I just break it down by event. So whatever's critical that day, whether I have a distance I want to ride, row, run, climb, or altitude or elevation I want to get to that day, I just break it down into small chunks. However, I've got a very clear image of the finish line in my head. And I think that's interesting. I've thought about this in the past, that I can visualize exactly the feelings and the visual stimuli I'm going to get when I get to that port in Brest, France, or when I get to the top of Everest. So actually more important than Everest would be the bottom of Everest, because you're not done till you get down. So I very, very clearly visualize success at the end. But I keep that as sort of that carrot hanging in front of me, but each day the main carrot is to get to, that next bend in the road, like I said, or that next rock on the ridge, or around that peak, or by that crevasse. Or so for some reason I've always been able to clearly visualize success at the end, and I think that really helps. And I think you see that in things like gymnastics, you see that in things like golf and other sports, where I think people who tend to excel or succeed or experience some kind of success know what success looks like at the end. And I think that really helps. I don't have the intellect to really describe it any better than that, but I think that being able to visualize success, the feeling of it, right down to what you're going to see, but especially the emotion of it, really helps. If you can visualize the emotion of success, I think that's extremely important to completing a long goal or a long trip.
Right. Yeah, no, I got to imagine, and I'm sure this might be what you speak about, but I have to imagine there's just, so many parallels, because as you're describing Everest, like that was a lot like writing my book, right? Like you're just trying to make slow progress every day, but you keep the end in mind. So there's a lot of things probably in life that those parallels, I think, that just because, this culture is so fast, but things that are great.
Writing a book is a perfect example of it. I mean, I can't even, coming from a guy who does the stuff I do, for me to say that, I can't imagine the effort involved in that, and the grinding, slow pace of it, with the end in sight, with the emotion in sight. And it's so important that emotion is part of that final view, because, or that final goal, because we can motivate people with stuff you say, or a conference you go to, or pictures I show you about a trip, whether it's a spectacular photo of Everest or the ocean, or a whale beside my boat, or whatever. But if I don't combine that with emotion, it doesn't work. We need that emotion, I think, as people. We need that human story, and we need, in order to visualize a success, we need to know what the emotion is going to be like at the end. And one thing that's uncomfortable or problematic with adventuring is that it's like a drug. You get to the end, and a month before I got to France, I was already thinking about what am I going to do next. You know what I mean?
Right.
And it's addictive.
Right. Yeah. No, I can imagine. So Lionheart Kicker is a final question we ask every guest, and it's based on advice. So if you could give blanket advice, or guaranteed everybody in the world would hear it, and this can be on adventure, or just on what you've known, what you've learned about life, what advice would you give people?
Realize how short it is. Realize how short life is. I mean, that's one of the most important things to realize, is how quickly things pass, and how quickly this window of opportunities to do these types of things closes. So number one is to realize how short it is, how tenuous it is. And of course, losing a 21-year-old boy puts an extremely fine point on that. And then the number two thing is for God's sakes, look after your health. I just think it is so important that we are fit and healthy. If you're not healthy, then life is just not available to you. And put the time in, make it part of your lifestyle. Don't go on a diet. Make the healthy way you eat part of your lifestyle. Just make it who you are. Make exercise as important as putting your pants on in the morning. Make that it is that much of a priority. So, I mean, those are two very basic cliche things, but if you realize how short life is, it'll get you to do stuff. It'll move you to action. And then in order to accomplish that, you have to have your health. You have to have your fitness. Don't wait on that. You know, if you're listening to this podcast and you're thinking about going for a run later, the way you're going to go for a run is to go tie your shoes. Start lacing up that shoe, and you're going to get out and you're going to do it. And it's you know, people are going to look at my sort of resume as an adventurer and think, oh, it's easy for him to say, but I've got the same hangups as everybody else. I've got the same need to delay things and to procrastinate and to think I'm going to do it later. Just get it done. And it's so easy, and it's an immediate reward to not do something. But when you do something, the reward may come after a hard workout in the gym for an hour or a long run, but the reward is going to last that much longer. So step outside your comfort zone, shove off from that dock, and get stuff done.
Yeah, I really like that quote right there. Life's just not available to you without that fitness. That is like,
yeah, it's you can sit there and read about it all you want, and right. Like I say, be on the glass all you want on your phone and Instagram and Facebook, and read about other people's adventures, but put it down. Go to the gym, go for a run, go for a walk, get on your bike, go to the beach, but get outside and move.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to ask real quick about that is when it comes to getting that perspective, and it's okay if it's a no, but do you think it's possible for people to get that perspective and to know that life is short? Because intellectually knowing and actually feeling, of course, are different. Do you think it's possible without having some kind of, you know, tragedy or close call that tells you that?
It must be, because my mom remembers when I turned 8 that I started crying as a little boy because I was getting old and I wanted to be young forever. And so it's always been with me. And then all this did was just sort of, you know, when we lost Richard, just really put a sharp point on it again. But we already knew it was there. We know life is short. I mean, people have to know that. And as a young person, as a teenager, somebody in the early 20s, it doesn't seem short. But I'm in my 40s now, and I look back, and I can't believe how quickly stuff has gone by. Like a year now in your 40s, especially with children, is nothing. 2 years is nothing. And, life is short. You know, this is your only chance, and you gotta get after it. You gotta get shit done, and you gotta do uncomfortable things. I can't stress that enough. This life is not about being comfortable.
Right.
The best times in life are when you experience discomfort. They really are. They're the most valuable times. They're the things that people hearken back to when they're talking about their life. They don't talk about, you know, all the easy breezy things that they did, or the time sitting around a couch, or the movies they watched. They talk about the times when they were challenged and stressed, and they got strength from that. And we just live in a culture now where it's all just so easy. It's easy to travel by looking at Instagram.
Yeah.
Travel in your mind. It's easy to live other people's lives that are perfect by looking at Facebook or Twitter. It's easy to be anonymous on social media, but you're not living. I mean, we've got to put down the damn glass, and we've got to get out there and move. And discomfort's okay. It's okay to walk outside when it's cold and go for a run. Like I went for a run yesterday, and it's not cold for here, so all the Canadians listening are going to giggle, but it was like -6 or -7. And, you know, I've got friends who say, you ran in this weather? I'm like, my God, man, there's no bad weather. It's just bad gear, bad clothing.
Right.
I run at -30. I bike at -46. Like it's you just have to dress for it.
Yeah.
It takes a little bit more effort. It's going to be a little uncomfortable until you warm up, but it's far more rewarding than sitting in the house watching TV.
Right. Yeah. No. Listeners of this show know that I will definitely agree with you. I think that it's just a wild thing we do. We mistake being comfortable for being happy, and then we end up with this. It ends up being problematic over time.
Well, that's a great way. That's a great quote, that we mistake being comfortable for being happy. And you see it all the time. I mean, you've got SUVs that you can order meals now through the dash of your SUV and have it delivered to your house. You can, you know, it's all about everything at our fingertips and no effort, no discomfort. And I hate that. I think I think discomfort is such. I heard it on I think it was the Joe Rogan podcast. He said, one of his quotes I really enjoyed was that it's all rounded edges and nerve corners in our worlds.
Yeah. Right. Isn't that true though? Everything's so bubble wrapped, right? We're so afraid of hurting and getting hurt and hurting, it is interesting, this kind of weird paradigm we're in. But then also the people that are, there seems to be, in my mind, a shift toward back toward our roots, at least in some circles, where people are realizing where we're at as a culture, and like something within our soul is just really like crying out for this adventure and this.
Yeah, and taking responsibility if something goes wrong. If something goes wrong in your life, is taking responsibility for it. And I think we should all have equal opportunities, but that doesn't mean that we all are guaranteed the same outcomes. Outcomes are based on how hard you work and the decisions that you make. So, yeah, let's all give us the same chance at accomplishing things, but let's not guarantee the outcome.
Right.
And that is that's seen now in kids playing sports where after a 5-goal difference in a game, they don't put it on the scoreboard anymore, and that type of thing. I mean, competition, discomfort, and hard work is critical.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. For people that also agree and they want to follow along with you and support your journey and stay in touch with what you're doing, where's the best place for them to do that?
Pretty easy on Twitter and Instagram at Laval St.Germain. So I'll spell it out: LavalStGermain. And my website is lavalstgermain.com. So it's spelled exactly like it sounds. It's not Laval. It's it's Laval.
That's my bad.
And I've got a contact me button there. You can go there, and I always answer emails and people reach out. You can tweet to me and follow along on the journey and share with me what you're doing and the discomfort that you're going through or plans that you have. I just love it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing your journey with us.
Thanks for having me on, Rick. It's my pleasure.
Perfect. Thanks, guys. Thanks for listening to Lionheart Radio. I hope that the information from today's show will make you fitter, happier, and healthier. For the show notes of this episode and every episode, head to www.lionheartrad.io. Yep, just like Lionheart Radio. And please, if you have the time, head over to iTunes and give us a 5-star rating. It really helps us to know that we're on the right track in delivering you reliable information and value. As always, feedback is welcome. If you have any comments on the show or would like to suggest a guest, send me an email at rick@luavive.com. That's LUAVIVE.com. Thanks for your support, and we will see you next time.
Bitch, I feel good. Don't I look stupendous? My shine is so endless, and shit you can do to end this. Even when I'm dead, niggas still gon' bump that chip shit. Coke, white, Escalade on cinches for you dipshit. So you won't forget this. Midwest nigga be the coldest. Cleveland